Good morning and greetings in Jesus' name this morning. For a message this morning, I'd like to take a text from 1 Corinthians 10, verses 14 through 22. And if I was thinking of a title for this message, I would probably say The Cup of the Lord or The Cup of Devils, and with a question mark. And this might not be the typical communion message that we might think of immediately, but a couple weeks ago, I was starting to think about what to preach for communion messages. It is the same theme every time, and so sometimes it takes me a little bit to decide where to go. But I came across these verses in 1 Corinthians 10 and 11 as well, and I was just challenged by what the argument here that Paul is making and how he bases it so much on communion, on the Lord's table and communion to talk about idolatry. Let's read these verses. First of all, to begin here, that was 1 Corinthians 10, 14 through verse 22. Also interesting, up there, if you look in verse 9, it talks about the Old Testament examples, and it says, "Neither let us tempt Christ as some were tempted and were destroyed of serpents." And so we have kind of a visual up here this morning for that verse, but that's not really our theme this morning. Let's read, starting at 14. "Wherefore, my dearly beloved, flee from idolatry. I speak as to wise men, judge ye what I say. The cup of blessing which we bless, is it not the communion of the blood of Christ? The bread which we break, is it not the communion of the body of Christ? For we, being many, are one bread and one body, for we all are partakers of that one bread. Behold, Israel after the flesh, are not they which eat of the sacrifices partakers of the altar? What say I then, that the idol is anything, or that which is offered in sacrifices to idols is anything? But I say that the things which the Gentiles sacrifice, they sacrifice to devils, and not to God. And I would not that ye should fellowship with devils. Ye cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of devils. Ye cannot be partakers of the Lord's table and of the table of devils. Do we provoke the Lord to jealousy? Are we stronger than he?" So these verses, we might look at these verses and think they sound a little outdated for our time. After all, we don't have pagan temples around us where we're tempted to take part in idolatrous ceremonies or offerings, food offerings, or things like that. Now, in other parts of the world, that is much more a reality, but in our culture, we don't really think about that in the sense that Paul was writing about here. But I think there are some lessons here that apply to us today just as much as they did in Paul's time, at the time when Paul wrote them here. And again, this might not be the first set of verses we would think of in relation to communion, but there are some very valuable lessons we can learn from these verses. And Paul uses the Lord's Supper or communion as the best example that he can think of as to why it's important that we consider that when we take part in something communal, or we fellowship with something, that it has a lot more power than sometimes we imagine. And he says it's both for good, but he also follows up by also giving the bad, that when we fellowship with something evil, we become partaker in that as well. Now, this section of verses is basically divided into 4 parts here. You have his first statement, flee from idolatry. That's pretty clear. Flee from idolatry, run away from it. And then his challenge to his readers there, I speak to you as wise men and women, judge ye what I say. And so I hope that's what I'm speaking to this morning, too, wise men and women that are willing to listen to this and follow through with kind of the arguments or the points that he makes here as to why we need to flee from idolatry, and then how that is tied in with the Lord's Supper. The Greek word for participation is koinonia, and in the Lord's Supper, verses 16 and 17, it talks about how we are participants in that, and how as we practice the Lord's Supper, we become communal participants with Christ and with other believers. Paul makes a special point that the Lord's Supper is also about uniting us as believers as a common partnership. And the Greek word koinonia basically means sharing, partnership, participation, partaking, fellowship. All those words kind of all mean that same thing. And so that word comes up a lot in the New Testament, the Greek word, and so a lot of these English words are based off of that Greek word. Then in verse 18, you see the kind of the true koinonia illustrated. And then verse 19 and 20, and it talks in verse 18 about how the people of Israel, the children of Israel, experienced that when they took part in the peace offerings, the sacrifices. And then in verses 19 and 22, you have false koinonia illustrated. Those who sacrifice to demons or to idolatries, to idols, they become partners with demons, is the point that Paul is making here. It says devils in the King James. That's another way of saying the same thing. And God does not permit those who are partners with demons to also be participation with him. You can choose one or you can choose the other, but you can't be both. And so all these parts, these different points here are backing up his first statement, which is flee from idolatry. And you can picture, maybe just to start thinking about that, and maybe we'll talk about this a little later, the idea of being in a river and being sucked towards a waterfall by the current, that he's saying, get out while you still can, basically, before you meet your end or meet doom by going over that waterfall. And so Paul is using these here two examples in the verse, maybe we'll go back there to verses 15 to 16. He's using two examples here to make a contrast with true worship and idol worship. So he keeps comparing these two things. What is the difference between what true worship is and partaking in the Lord's Supper, and what is idol worship? And his first example here that he brings up in verse 16 is communion, or the Lord's Supper. And the key word again in this whole section is participation or partaking, which this all comes from this Greek word koinonia. And you see it repeated 4 times, twice in verse 16, once in verse 18, and once in verse 20. That same theme of participation or taking part, partaking, keeps coming up here as a main theme and one of the main concepts of communion. And again, communion is that common union that we have with Jesus and with one another, and that's what communion, one of the things that communion represents, is the bond that we have with each other, and of course, most importantly, with Jesus and his shed blood and broken body. So koinonia is the same word for fellowship, and when we take communion, I hope, and hopefully we're not going through just the motions, that it's something that we just do as a ritual every 2 times a year, and we just go through the motions, but we're actually participating in it, not just because we're doing it, but because we're aware of it and we're thinking about it, and we're thinking about how it applies to our lives, not just a ritual that we go through. And so when we drink the cup and we eat the bread, we are taking part in something that's dynamic, not just a ritual, but something that I participate in because Jesus did this for me. It's personal. It's something that we're thinking about. It's personal and it's communal, and so we apply it personally to our lives, and we also think about the bond that we have with each other and how it draws us closer to Christ as well. In verse 16, Paul also highlights the idea here of this being an act of thanksgiving, or it says in some translations say a thanksgiving, and some say the cup of blessing, which is somewhat the same word, Eucharisto. That's a Greek word meaning thanksgiving. And so Paul's question in verse 16 here brings together these two ideas of both participating and sharing, and also of thanksgiving and blessing. And so those are kind of the two of the main themes of why we do communion. What it means to us is, again, the participation and the commemoration and the thanksgiving and blessing. And so he's using the Lord's Supper here to make a point to the Corinthians, or to use this as an illustration, again, about what true participation, what true fellowship means, versus what it also can mean when we do that in a wrong way. I think it's kind of bringing up the question that we are still tempted to ask just as much back then as now as they did back then, when we're trying to decide what's right and what's wrong for a Christian. And namely, the problem with asking, but what's wrong with it, as a way to judge whether something is good or bad. I think that's one of the points here that Paul is making, not only in all the chapters surrounding here. He keeps bringing this up about Christian liberty and how we decide what we can do as Christians, what we have liberty to do. And one of the points that I think you can see in here is the wrong question to ask is, but what's wrong with it? That is, I think, what Paul is trying to illustrate in these verses here. So he contrasts true koinonia, the union that we have with communion, the blood of Christ and the broken body of Christ. He contrasts that then with or second example here, getting ahead of myself. The second positive example he uses here is the people of Israel, how they took part in the communion when they gave sacrifices. And so in Deuteronomy 14:23, you can turn there if you want, but it's just one verse, and I'll read that. Deuteronomy 14:23, and also 26, just the last part of that, is where it talks about this. It says, "And thou shalt eat before the Lord thy God in the place which he shall choose to place his name there, the tithe of thy corn, of thy wine, and of thine oil, and the firstlings of thy herds and of thy flocks, that thou mayest learn to fear the Lord thy God always." And then also in 26 of the same chapter, it says, "And thou shalt eat there before the Lord thy God, and thou shalt rejoice, thou and thine household." And so what you see here is this, what would have been called the peace offering, which was, again, also found in Leviticus 3 and Leviticus 7, where it explains what that is. And I'll just read a little bit here from Bible Dictionary. It says, "The peace offering could be from cattle, sheep, or goats, and it was characterized by the offering of an animal without defect. The offering was divided into three main parts. The fat and certain internal organs were burned on the altar as a pleasing aroma to the Lord. The breast and the right thigh were given to the priests, and the remaining meat was consumed by the offerer and their family in a communal meal." And so they gave this offering, a lamb or an animal without defect. It was divided up into these parts, and then some of it was offered to the Lord as an offering to him. Some was offered to the priests, and then some was eaten by the family of the person that gave the offering. And so it was a communal meal. I'm not sure if they actually shared this with the priests at the same time, but I think maybe that was separate. I didn't dig into that a whole lot. So there was this communal aspect to participating in the sacrifice, not only giving it to God and participating in that way, the vertical, but also participating with each other too in a communal way. And Paul is using this example from the Old Testament here from their temple worship to explain that when the Jews sacrificed an animal at the altar and then ate together, they became partakers in the sacrifice. They took a very active role in this, and they became partakers in it. And so in a very real way, they were taking part in the offering. It wasn't just something they were supposed to do as a ritual either, but they were supposed to, again, it was supposed to be a dynamic thing that they took part in. And so Paul's argument here is that if you believe that these sacrifices were truly commanded and blessed by God, and that by taking part in those sacrifices, the children of Israel were honoring God and communing with him, then you also need to believe that when you offer food to idols and you commune in that way, there are spiritual forces that are at work in that situation as well. And that's what Paul is kind of, the point he's trying to make here is that if these things are true, that there's a communion with God and other people in communion, and also when they sacrificed in the Old Testament, then when we commune with idols, there's also a spiritual force that becomes alive there, and that we have to reckon with as we think about, what was right in their situation, what could they eat of the meat that was offered to idols, and what was wrong for them to do. So that was Paul's illustrations of what true koinonia looked like, true fellowship, true communion looked like. Then in verses 19 and 20, he starts to talk about what the false looks like, or those who sacrifice the demons and become partners with the demons, like he talks about here with the devils. Maybe just to give a little background here, it seems like the Corinthians here were kind of struggling with using their Christian liberty to make a point that they could attend some of the pagan feasts or eat meat that was sacrificed to idols in the temples and not be corrupted by it. And so they were kind of using their Christian liberty and saying, if God is, if we're Christians now, it doesn't matter if we go to the temple courts and eat the meat that's offered to the idols, because we can do that under our Christian liberty. And Paul he makes a point later on in these verses down a little further that they were allowed to eat this meat in their own homes. If it was sacrificed to idols, that was allowed. But when you went into the temple and ate it in the temple food court, or whatever you want to say, they kind of had like restaurants, apparently. That's not what they would have called them, but there was actually food there in the temple court that you could go to, and it was especially blessed by the idols and blessed to them. And so when you went and ate that meat offered to idols in the temple, it meant that you were taking a part in the worship of that, or that you were making a special effort to somehow take part in the worship that they were doing in those temples. And so just like Christ's presence is honored and commemorated in the Lord's Supper, so in the same way the devil was honored and celebrated in idolatry, and still is to this day, maybe not as in quite as blatant a way as it was there, but in many places in the world it is just as much that way. And he says, Paul makes a point here too, that yes, he says idols are, they're worthless pieces of wood and stone. They're nothing to them. They're not alive and they don't have any power of themselves. But when humans worship these things, they in a sense become living because there is a power behind it. So the idols themselves are still dead pieces of wood or stone, but the worship is directed to demons instead of to God or to Satan. And in Paul's day, almost everybody but Christians and Jews worshipped many different gods. That was also in the setting here and what was in their culture. They especially worshiped gods they thought would be useful to them. And so there was pretty much a god for everything you could possibly imagine, with a small g. And people kind of thought that the more gods they worshipped, well, the more chance that one of these gods would help them out in some way. And the Romans, when they went through and conquered people, they didn't really make the people give up these gods. They just kind of joined them in, and they believed that there was kind of safety in numbers, and so they worshiped this whole multitude of gods. And again, the thinking was that the more gods that were honored, the better the chance that one of these gods would do something good for me or would benefit me in some way instead of maybe causing me problems. Nobody quite knew what the gods would do and how they acted, and so it was a very uncertain worship. But this blending together of many beliefs is called syncretism, and Paul totally rejects this. He says we believe in one God, and this whole blending together of different gods, syncretism, is something that we have no part in with Christians. And so his attempt here, he tries to convince the Corinthians that their fellowship with Christ was made it so that they could not associate with any other gods. And this was probably a little hard for them to get into their minds because they had grown up with this idea that you have all these gods, and so you kind of pick and choose the ones you want and try to worship as many as possible. And Paul is telling these Corinthians, no, that is not how it works. It does matter who you worship, and it has to be one God, not a multitude of gods. And so, as they may have been thinking, well, why not? Why not, kind of spread out our chances a little bit and worship some of these gods and worship Jesus and God, the God of the Bible as well. And that's what Paul was trying to speak out against, is no, this is not the question, why not? And I think that probably parents who have teenagers might best understand the difficulty of saying no about attending some event or reading something or listening to something or watching something, because as parents we see there's more harm than good in this. And how do you explain to children why they may not participate in something when even those around them are participating in it? And the question is going to probably come up, but what's wrong with it? And again, that's kind of what Paul I think is trying to combat here in these verses, but the problem with, but what's wrong with it? So when Christians are trying to decide what is right and wrong, Paul says the wrong question is, but what's wrong with it? Instead, his admonition is to flee from it. That's his clear directive here, is don't ask what's wrong with it, but if it's something that is questionable, especially something that's fairly clear like idol worship, flee from it and put it as far away from you as possible. Again, we talked a little bit of that illustration of being in the river, but imagine that you're canoeing down the Niagara River. Maybe you're one of the first explorers, because if you're on the Niagara River, probably most of us would be aware of something coming up. But if you didn't know that, and all of a sudden you began to realize that the current is getting a little bit faster, your canoe is going a little faster, and you hear kind of a faint roar in the background, what do you think you would be doing at that point? Would you keep going down the river some more? What's the harm in getting a little closer to the edge? Let's see how close we can get to the edge of this waterfall before we pull the canoe into land, and see how big this waterfall is. Well, obviously, no. Once you would realize that, you see the current getting faster, you hear the noise, and you realize there's a waterfall ahead, you're going to get to land as fast as you can and go up and investigate what's ahead of you, if you have any kind of wisdom. And I think that's what Paul is warning here in the same way. Don't try to find out how close you can get to sin and idolatry and communing with devils, but instead think about the Lord's Supper. And that's the illustration that he draws their minds to here. Think about being part of the communion with the death of Jesus and the fellowship of believers, and ask how the thing that you're considering to do, whether it's right or wrong, fits into that picture, rather than, but what's wrong with it. Paul makes it very clear there in verse 21. He says, you cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of demons too. You cannot have a part in both the Lord's table and the table of demons. And so one of the points that Paul is making here is we make choices about what's right and wrong. The Lord's table helps us to make the right decision. As we think about that and we process, how do I live in relation to the Lord's table, to taking communion, to being right with God, how does that affect how I make decisions for right or wrong? And communion reminds us that where our actions and how our worship should be directed, in the places and the way it should be directed. And it reminds us about our participation by asking the question again, are we participating with the Lord, or are we participating with demons? A pretty black and white choice there between the two. And sometimes it seems awfully gray, but Paul is saying it's not that gray. When we're not sure, when we're trying to say about what's wrong with it, we're often probably leaning more towards communing with the demons rather than with the Lord. And God, here in verses 21 and 22 here, God does not permit those who are partners with demons to also be partners with him. There's one or the other, and that's illustrated here in these verses. Today we don't have these pagan temples where we worship idols, and so again, this has nothing to do with us, right? We don't do this anymore, but the question is, or do we? Our culture has places of worship that are almost the same, places like theaters and arenas that have a lot of the same characteristics of idol worship that they had back then. Maybe it's not as religious or as ceremonial, but the adoration and the enthusiasm with which people go to these things would make you wonder how close it does get to worship. And today our culture doesn't worship idols of stone and gold, but instead we, in a sense, worship idols of living people like singers and actors and athletes and people like that. People that are just as ridiculous to worship as the idols of Paul's time. Again, it's always ridiculous to worship a person who is just like us, only maybe just in a different situation. But the world has no problem admitting that they have idols. There's the TV show American Idol. Right there, right in the words, that's what they're calling this. That's what people are going on this show and striving to be, is the next big hit in music. And I think that just to drive this home, in verse 7 here, if you look back in this chapter, Paul says, he's talking about the Jews back in the Old Testament, or the children of Israel. Neither be ye idolaters, as were some of them, as it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. And I think that's interesting how clearly there he ties idolatry to a lifestyle or a culture of entertainment. Again, he was, of course, referencing the golden calf that they had set up, and it says they went to worship the golden calf, and then afterwards, it says here in verse 7 that they sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. And so if we believe that in, again, sharing communion together as a church body, we are taking an active part in the blood and the body of Jesus and his death, and that when the world worships idols, they are taking part in a fellowship with demons, how close do we want to get to fellowshipping with them in idol worship? Do we want to go right up to the courtyard? Do we want to go into the courtyard of the temple? How close do we want to get to that when it's either one or the other? Can we go to their games and their concerts and theaters and come away untainted? And I think the clear answer from these verses is no. Paul's answer to this is flee from it. Don't see how close you can get to it, but run away from it. And again, if you believe there's meaning and value to communion, to that fellowship with Jesus and taking part in him, if you believe that, then you have to accept the opposite, that the pagans have their own kind of communion, their own kind of fellowship, and you can't drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of demons. Then in verse 22, there's one more argument here that Paul brings up. He says, do we provoke the Lord to jealousy, or are we stronger than he? And I think there's a sense here where Paul is making an argument maybe about God's jealousy for his people here related to idol worship. But if you look at the word communion, now I'm talking about it, just the word without a capital C, as in the Lord's table or the Lord's Supper. The definition is the sharing or exchanging of intimate thoughts and feelings, especially on a mental or spiritual level. And that's the secular definition of the word, but it gets to one of the points of communion, that it's a sign of our intimate spiritual connection with God through Jesus and his death and resurrection. That's one of the things that we think about as we practice communion. And the Bible talks about the church being the bride of Christ, and in the same way that a husband and wife have an intimate bond that is to remain only between themselves, in that very same way, Christians have a bond between God, and God, it says he's jealous of that bond. He cares about it, and he values it, as we should as well. And he wants that to stay pure and for us to stay devoted only to him. We call this fidelity, or the idea of remaining true to one. And what is idolatry? In Colossians 3:5, it says, put to death, therefore, whatever belongs to your earthly nature, sexual immorality, impurity, lust, evil desires, and greed, which is idolatry. And that list of things there is what Paul calls idolatry in Colossians. So idolatry, it also defined, can be called infidelity to God. It's breaking that bond between God and worshiping something other than him. It's replacing our worship with him with the worship of something else, whatever that is, whatever idol that may be. And Paul again asks the question here, do we provoke the Lord to jealousy? Do we think we're stronger than he is? Putting it in my own words. So idol worship is unfaithfulness to God, and it's kind of like an angry spouse who, if the other partner commits adultery, there's probably going to be feelings of anger, certainly a betrayal with the other partner. Recently I heard of somebody that he said he talked to a man that had committed adultery with his wife recently, and he repented of it and was talking to him about it, just kind of telling him what happened. But he said after he told his wife, there was things being thrown around and broken in the room, maybe people from a slightly different culture than we are from, but people react very strongly when this marital bond is broken, and in this case, the wife was understandably angry, and she was jealous of what had happened in this case. In this case, they were Christians, so she decided she did want to forgive and reconcile, and so there'll be a struggle ahead in this case. It's not like it's an easy journey, but they made the right decision. But there's still that betrayal and that anger that goes along with it. In the same way, God is similarly jealous of our worship. He wants it for himself. He doesn't want it to go to some other idol or to something that stands in the way of him. And Paul is warning the Corinthians here. He thought they were the stronger ones. It talks about the weaker brother and the stronger brother. And I think it was probably the stronger ones who kind of thought maybe they were the ones that could go eat in the temple courts here and eat this meat offered to idols, he says, do you want to invoke the wrath of God? And in Isaiah 45:9, that verse, it says, woe unto him that striveth with his maker. Let the potsherd strive with the potsherds of the earth. Shall the clay say to him that fashioned it, what makest thou, or thy work? He hath no hands. And again, Isaiah is illustrating how ridiculous it is for the pot, he says, to talk back to the person that made it, to the potter, and tell him how he should be acting or how it should be fashioned, that God is jealous and he has power, and if we are not aware of that, or if we don't value that, we're treading on very dangerous ground. Do we provoke the Lord to jealousy, or are we stronger than he? And so all of these verses, again, go back to verse 14, wherefore, my dearly beloved, flee from idolatry. And I think as we think about these verses, it does apply to communion, and as we're going to shortly do that, how much of a difference does it make in our lives? Is it just a ritual, or do we see how much that's a dynamic thing that we practice that shows our common bond with Christ and with God, and that fellowship that we have with each other as well? Paul saw it as very important here that it was the best illustration he could think of to illustrate that and to show why it was wrong to worship demons or to worship idols and give them this glory. So in closing here, communion is a time when we remember the work of Jesus on the cross. We remember his broken body and his shed blood, and how that gave us power over death and joined us to God the Father. It also unites us as believers with a common bond as God's chosen people, not just because we were born into the children of Israel like in the Old Testament, but because we have, each one of us that's taking part has willingly joined the body of Christ, and that's what unites us together, is that unity, that koinonia that we were talking about, and that it talks about a lot in these verses, that we're united in the sharing and the suffering of Jesus. And so while the world will try to draw us away with its own false versions of this, false koinonia, false communion, the worship of devils, at the Lord's table is where we find true communion with God and with our fellow believers. And that's, I think, the main thing that we can bring from these verses, and that I wanted us to remember this morning, is that communion, true communion, is what separates us and what makes us different than the rest of the world. And so let's remember that as we practice that this morning. This time, why don't we kneel for a word of prayer?